Okay, and we are live. Hello, and welcome to another Ask Databricks. So the whole point of today is to take all of your questions and pass it back to the Databricks team directly. And today the theme is going to be all about Databricks workflows. So if you've ever tried to orchestrate anything, you've got jobs to run, you've got tasks to sequence, and you want to work out how to do that best in Databricks, then this is the live stream that you need to be on. So I'm going to bring on Roland in just a moment. Here we go. Hi, Roland. Welcome to the show.
Awesome. Hey, Simon. How are you? It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, I am good, but I am warm. I'm coming live from the behind the scenes in the speaker lounge at Big Data London, and I've been running all over the place, hence why it's fairly chaotic, and I don't have my normal background. I am stuck in a corner of a speaker room. How are you doing today?
Data London. Wow.
How are you? Things good?
All good. All good. Yeah, thanks. Super excited to be here and talk about workflows with you all and answer a bunch of questions. Yeah, it's awesome. I've been watching your show for a while.
Been making it for a while. Okay, so Ron, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, about your role in Databricks, what you're doing, all of that good stuff?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm a product manager at Databricks. I've been with Databricks for roughly 2.5 years. And I'm taking care of two types of products that we have. One is Databricks Workflows, which we'll talk about a lot more here today, which is basically orchestration of all of your data and machine learning pipelines. And then the other one is also we're enabling serverless in the context of workflows. So also working on that. I've been doing that for 2.5 years at Databricks. And then I've also been a product manager at Google and have been consulting tech companies before that.
Very cool. I mean, how did you get into it? How did you decide that tech was the way you wanted to go to? Were you we went to school studying orchestration tools?
Well, I actually thought, what can I actually... So I actually studied physics, so something completely different, right? I had a PhD in plasma physics. And then I said, okay, what's out there? What's in industry? So consulting was a great way to get into that and to know about real world company problems. And so I've done a lot of data analytics actually as part of my PhD. So analyzing, experimental data, doing, code for simulations of what would happen. And so working in tech consulting was then one way to get that real world experience. How does it actually work in companies and how do they work? And then I wanted to sort of know how the full life cycle of a product works. And so naturally, living all of the ups and downs of a product and how to get it out and how to make it useful for everybody was one of the things that I wanted to experience. And so helping folks actually then make use of that data at a larger scale I find super exciting. And so Databricks is the place where we actually help a lot of companies then achieve that goal of not having to have thousands of people ready to provide all of that infrastructure. There's a turnkey solution for a unified place for all your data and analytics, and so that's super exciting. I've seen a lot of folks struggle with that, and so helping them is my mission, and helping them particularly in the context of orchestration, of course, with Databricks workflows. So yeah.
Very great, cool.
I got to that.
So it's been a journey to arrive where you are now.
A total journey, yeah. I mean, if I think back at the day when we started this is way before my time for workflows, right? I think Databricks, it's been fairly clear from the beginning that when customers write the code, when they want to run it on Spark, that they need some way to actually now make this automated. You want to schedule it. You don't want to always have to press a button or write your own scripts to do that, and you want that to be super reliable. So I think it's been actually back in 2015 when we first announced sort of, hey, you can actually run this automatically right now. And this was more like a cron-based kind of thing. And you could schedule an individual notebook, schedule that code for it. And I think it was actually Ali Ghodsi, our CEO, who actually wrote the blog post about it back in the day. And so since then, it's actually been quite a journey, and workflows has been evolving ever since. I think it was 2016 when we added notebook workflows. And so that allowed then customers to actually say, hey, I don't only want to run this code on these couple of cells, but let me also run these other right after that, and modularizing a little bit more and giving you more observability as a result of that. And so,
let's roll back a little bit. So if someone's coming into this and they're saying, well, when we're saying workflows, what actually is it? Is it just Databricks jobs? Is it a rebrand? Or actually, what does the whole of workflows actually mean? How do you pitch it?
Yeah. So So people have known this for a while as jobs, basically. So when we talk about workflows, we actually just mean the product is called workflows, and then there's objects in them, which are jobs, which contain a bunch of configuration. For example, when should it run? It contains eccles, as whom should I run? It contains parameters with which it applies to the code that you will actually execute. Most importantly, also it contains a DAG, so a directed acyclic graph of all of the different tasks that you want to run one after each other. And so now that's kind of the hierarchy. Think of workflows as the umbrella of it. Think of that as the product name. And then we've got these objects, multiple jobs that you can actually run on a schedule within that. And each of those jobs contains tasks. So these nodes in the DAG and this directed acyclic graph are actually what we call tasks. We have many different types of tasks. So the classic one I've mentioned a couple of times is a notebook with Python or SQL code or Scala or whatever floats your boat. We've got plenty of those right now. It could also be control flow. So you could say like, hey, if something has happened in this previous task, then run this task. If not, run another task. Something very exciting coming soon is, for example, for each, where you can start looping over these values. Yeah, exactly. Lots of people are looking forward to that one. And so really, it's orchestration of all of those different tasks. It's control flow, and it's running them very deterministically. Super stable, super reliable. That's kind of the things that we do. And I think the nice thing is also, besides making it stable, is also that if it is within Databricks, it makes it very easy to use. It's this unified platform that allows you to do anything for analytics. And then, of course, you need to be able to schedule these workloads, run dependencies between them. And Databricks Workflows makes that easy.
Yeah. That's very cool. I mean, so I do have a grumble. I've got my nerdy engineering grumble.
Tell me.
That the world of Spark, obviously, you kick off a command, it configures a Spark action, and you get jobs, stages, and tasks.
Yes.
And then we go up to workflows, and we've got jobs and tasks. And it's very confusing about which one we're talking about.
Yeah, the naming. There is tasks and jobs there as well. Yes. Maybe workflows helps a little bit with the naming there.
It does, because it means, like, have you checked the job? Wait, which job? The job that ran. Wait, the scheduled job?
Yeah.
Workflows makes it way easier. Actually, we've got two different things that we're talking about, which makes a lot of sense. Which is cool. Okay, so we're starting to get some questions in, so I can kind of start picking up some of the questions that we've got. So let's see. It's not about workflows. So this workflow is an alternative to Apache Airflow. I mean, so I guess that's going to be a big question in terms of most of what people do currently. Is going to be using external orchestration.
So the way we think about this actually is we're providing workflows for you to make things easy in terms of to use Databricks and make it easy to use Databricks. If you want to use Airflow or write your own scripts or do whatever you like, we're super happy for that. We ultimately just want to make it super easy, and we have a standardized API that you can use from whichever tool that you want to use. In fact, for Airflow particularly, we have a bunch of contributors in the company, and we're actively working to make the integration with Airflow and Databricks easier and better, so that you can use Airflow. If you're already using Airflow, just, that's fine. I think there's a few advantages to keep in mind, or when you're choosing an orchestrator to go one way or the other. And I think if you're using Databricks mainly, Workflows is just the simpler thing to use. It's much simpler to offer. It's fully integrated. It unifies the tooling landscape that you have. You don't have to worry about, do I have this Kubernetes cluster and managing that infrastructure? It's a fully managed service. And that makes it a lot easier. And there's a few more improvements that we're also doing that will also appeal, like CI/CD, better CI/CD support with DABs, for example, Databricks asset bundles, or the ability to more easily even version the code that you're deploying together with the jobs themselves, and also orchestrating things beyond Databricks is also something that we've just announced at Data and AI Summit that's also coming to Databricks Workflows. So those things will make it very easy and also very complete for Databricks Workflows to be a mature orchestrator. But again, like, we're providing a service fully managed, and you can use it, but of course you can pick any other service. It's an open API.
I mean, do you see people? I guess the way I see people tend to do it, it's one or the other. So people either use an external orchestrator, and then they're kicking off a ton of notebooks. So I've got 100 notebooks to run, and so I'm going to have my external orchestrator call each of those notebooks. Do you see people starting to include jobs as like sort of a modular part of code as part of that? To start to break it up and do some of that parallelism, some of those pieces as a chunk of jobs, and maybe still they need a higher level orchestrator for some things aren't in there yet as it matures, but starting to do that because I've not really seen that pattern out there.
Yeah, so I think there is two ways in which you can segment it. One way is like you're saying, hey, you can actually have sort of a meta level orchestrator, and then you can sort of say execute this job on Databricks for the things that are on Databricks. And that's a pattern that we see not as often, though. What I see happening more often is sort of a segmentation by types of users. And so if you're thinking, we talked about simplicity, stability, on how to use workflows, we actually see even within individual customers, individual companies, where there are certain groups that are more sort of analyst focused, where, hey, I'm just getting started with SQL. I live most of my sort of analyst life or also data engineering life in Databricks. And then we see those user groups much more using workflows, even though they're in the same company where there is Airflow, for example, as well. And then we see also, transitioning going forth and back. So that's also a paradigm we see. We are building more things to also make it more attractive to sort of the data engineers, particularly, we talked about versioning, version control, Databricks asset bundles, the ability to orchestrate things externally, to develop in your local IDE. So that's very exciting, I think, particularly the data engineering persona.
I mean, so we do have a question lined up exactly on that. That's a beautiful segue. Nice. So what's the recommendation for migrating workflows between environments? So how do you do CI/CD and dev tests, etc.? But specifically, so yes, you've got Terraform asset bundles, but if devs are creating jobs in the UI, how do you then pull that down into source control and include it in some better process? How do you get them out?
Yeah. So for the longest time, it's been, I want to do CI/CD. We said, hey, use the CLI, use Terraform. And, there's a very steep learning curve with that. And so it's quite complex to use. Nevertheless, a lot of customers have actually used it. They're already familiar with Terraform, or, they started using and learning. We wanted to make it a lot easier to use that and deploy across various workspaces that might be sort of, your staging, your development workspace, might be your production workspace, and getting sort of into these data engineering best practices, really adopting those, we wanted to make a lot easier. So that's the idea for Databricks asset bundles. And what you can then do with Databricks asset bundles is actually like build on top of Terraform. We're like an abstraction layer for the most part on top of Terraform. And it allows you to then say, hey, all of these things, the code, configuration files, the jobs, YAML, they all belong together into one project. Might even contain things like testing, might contain configuration into which workspaces it should actually deploy at which stages. And so now you can say, hey, I actually want to deploy this to certain workspaces. You deploy that, it gets version controls on whatever platform you choose, for example, on Git. So you can see what's all the configuration on Git. If there's changes being made, you can request, hey, I actually want those changes. And you can review the code in Git, or you can go back into that workspace and see, hey, what's the change actually? How does it look like visually? Sometimes it's just more instructive to look at the DAG visually, looking at the JSON. And then you can say, hey, I actually want to deploy this. Yes, this is fine. And then you can deploy it to the next. The way we think about these workspaces is, as a best practice to actually separate out development and staging, and then have these reviews and best practices on when are you actually going to the next stage. So
cool.
That is the answer, I think, for bringing those best practices for CI/CD out to everybody.
That makes sense. And the tools available to do that it's way easier to do it than it used to be. Exactly. So many different options you can do. Then it used to be just recreate it. But now, you can put it down.
Yeah. Lots of folks writing their custom scripts, I think,
Yeah. I've written far too many of those myself. Okay, we got plenty more, so good questions coming in. And again, please add more questions as we go. Straightforward. Is there a way to trigger a workflow from an external API?
Yeah, absolutely. So we call it the jobs API, and there's like many ways you can do this. You could say, hey, I actually just want to create a new job. I want to run an existing job. I actually just want to submit a job, run it down, mostly forget about it later. Right? That's also a way to do it. So yes, there is a public API. You can run this from anywhere. That's effectively what you're doing when you are using Airflow, for example, or when you're writing your own script or using any other orchestrator of your choice. So it's a very easy to use API. Go check it out. And we also supply, for example, if you're interested in, hey, how do I actually structure the JSON? Just create a quick demo job for yourself. And then you can, there's like a 3-dot menu you can check out, hey, show me the JSON for that job. And that helps you get started very easily. There's also Databricks demos that can help you get started in workflows as well. I think Simon, you actually made an episode about that.
Shout out to Quentin.
Yeah, indeed. And so that also helps you get started using that very easily and quickly.
Cool. Yeah, makes sense. I mean, for us, a lot of our quick way of doing it is just to use the Databricks CLI and pull the specification down, and then throw that into source control and then deploy it to the places. That makes sense. But yeah, so the API is good, and the CLI is a wrap around the API, and essentially we all use the API. Everyone always customers. It's the only thing we all really actually use. It's good.
True.
All right. So other things that we have. So still on the external orchestrator thing, what's the best practice when you're having to include external orchestrators, because you're having to integrate with some things that Databricks doesn't integrate to, so you're kind of having to stitch together a couple of different environments. Have you got any advice, best practice for how people actually best?
Yeah, so I think the best way, if you're using your own script or an external orchestrator, is still to actually, for the Databricks things, have actually a workflow and create that job for the thing that you need, and then trigger that from the external system. I know that means you need to somewhat go forth and back, but it gives you a ton of advantages. It gives you, in terms of like cost and speed for the execution, you can use cluster reuse. So that means, when you actually run this job on Databricks, you can say, hey, I've got these 5 tasks. Only the first task is to spin up the cluster, taking roughly 5 minutes or so, and costing you as well. And then the next task can reuse that cluster. They're semantically related, right? So if you don't have significant cluster resizing or completely different specs, and with auto scaling you can resize the workers, and so that means you can use that same cluster throughout all of those tasks. And then that saves you, of course, time, because you don't need to spin up a new machine for every new task. But it also means it's going to save you, because of the time, but also, library installations, which can be a significant fraction of actually the task. You don't have to reinstall those again. So that's like one significant advantage. The other significant advantage is if you have it in Databricks workflows, is you can debug it much easier, because now you can see like every run, how long did it take, which were the tasks that have failed in the past, where are the things that took the, when something failed, I can go back in there and be like, hey, I actually want to repair this now, only run these tasks that have failed. And so it allows you much easier grasp of what has actually changed, how can I fix those things. So that's kind of the observability aspect of it. And the third thing is, if your code lives also in Databricks, it's easier to then just take one click. I can see the cluster spec. I can now go deep into Gang for my debugging. I can now see the code. I can fix the code. Everything's one click away. It's just much more integrated. And so I think these 3 things, if you're like focusing on stuff running on Databricks, is definitely much easier when you actually do it with the workflow. We're trying to integrate more with other orchestrators that provide some of that functionality, but it's just, it's a different tool, so there's always, it's always harder to integrate in that way.
No, of course. I mean, so I would triple underline the cost and speed aspect of it.
Yeah.
So there's lots of scenarios where if we're using an external orchestrator like Databricks, so even if you're using it, you're trying to kick a load of stuff up, you can either use, instant pools, and then everything's using jobs clusters, which is nice and cheap, but then every single one still has a startup time and everything runs on its own thing, and you end up using loads of compute, or you end up waiting ages because everything almost runs sequential. The ability just to say, run it all on the same thing and run it on a job cluster, which is cheaper, it's a huge time saver, but also it tends to go faster because you're reusing it. So double underline how important a thing that is to be able to do.
Yeah, actually for ADF specifically, there's no activity to run an existing job, but there is a web activity. And so there's actually like, an instruction online on how to actually run a job from ADF. That's an existing job that does use cluster reuse. So check that out. It's not too hard. You can set it up, and it's just a web activity, but you can still trigger these things from ADF.
A related question. So if you are doing that, so you've kicked off a workflow, it's using lots of parallel jobs, and it's on a cluster. What's the best way to calculate cluster cost? It's a tricky one.
It's a tricky one, yeah. So it really depends on what you're actually running. So obviously, you can set the cluster, right? It's not serverless yet, right? So we have serverless in a private preview coming soon. But for classic clusters, you know which instance types it is, Photon, you can see all of these specs. And by those specs, it's basically determined what's your run rate cost. There's some variability. You could scale up and down. All of this depends on the code. And so I think really the test is, and where we see a lot of folks actually having a hard time, and it's kind of the hardest experience that we have so far, and we're solving that with serverless, is sizing that cluster right. On the one side, you don't want it to boom or to be too small for the workload to take forever, right? Which not necessarily actually leads to cheaper costs, right? Because if this thing's just running very inefficiently and too small, it's not necessarily cheaper because it's going to run so much longer. On the other hand, if you oversize it, of course, you're going to be spending a lot of money for all machines, for maybe instance types that you wouldn't need otherwise. So that's also inefficient for you that you don't want to do. See a lot of people like iterating over this, run over run to get sort of a optimal solution, and it's very hard. It's a multivariable problem that's really difficult to solve. And so, nevertheless, we see that we have all of that data on what could we actually improve. But so the cluster specs are set, right? We can't just change them for the users. And so serverless is an answer in that regard, where we say, hey, we're actually taking the expertise that Databricks has in Spark, and also in, we're the largest requester of VMs on at least one of the large cloud platform machines, more than 10 million VMs a day that we request. And so that means we have all of that data, train models to actually auto-optimize this for you. And so that's the idea with serverless. Where in serverless, we would be going, and you don't give us the cluster spec anymore. You tell us what you actually want to optimize this for. And then we would take charge of managing all of that infrastructure for you and optimizing that towards that almost business goal. Hey, I want speed for this one. Maybe, I want this knob a little bit more dialed to optimize for cost on the other one. And so if you give us those goals, we can take those models, we can take that experience and optimize that. So it takes also a lot of burden away from things like, setting up IP ranges, setting up a lot of things for me to be ready to actually deploy these clusters in the network becomes much, much easier. The time to size the clusters, we talked about this iteration, but also things like I need to make sure, that it has all the patches that I want, security, compliance things. We'll be taking care of that in serverless.
Cool. And that's coming to workflows, not just Delta light tables.
Exactly. Yeah. So workflows generally orchestrates a lot of things across the whole lakehouse, and so we also support a lot of types of compute. So classic clusters, of course, one of them. We spin them up for you in your cloud provider account. We also have warehouses support. SQL. So that means both for like the classic ones, which also set up the clusters, but also serverless SQL is supported. And now we're also working on support for serverless compute within workflows. And so that's then sort of this magic sauce that allows you to, I don't have to think about, the machine. I don't actually see the boxes anymore. I don't see, how many workers are you deployed. We'll take care of that. You just take care of the code, optimize that. Tell us what you want us to optimize the infrastructure for, and then we'll take care of that. That's in private right now, actually.
It's very cool. What you're basically saying is you don't need me anymore.
No, come on. I still need you. So many.
Okay. So we got another question around kind of almost like just defining what things are. So how do workflows relate to DLT? So
Yeah.
DLT is great for auto-loading and what things, but how do they actually stick together?
Yeah, I think they complement each other really well. And so you see a lot of like use cases where you could use one way or the other. And so in that case, we would actually recommend you should use DLT for ETL. It's the way to go. And you had Michael actually quite recently here. And so we think DLT is the future of how to do ETL. DLT sort of is one way of doing it. We see a lot of folks coming from a paradigm, hey, I actually still want to run this on a schedule. Even running a DLT on schedule is actually using work from each other really well. You might want to do things before you actually run the DLT. You might want to do things after that. And we see a lot of folks coming with a paradigm of, I have a paradigm of control flow. I know this thing needs to run, then this other thing needs to run, right? Instead of like thinking about what's the end product and have DLT figure it out, which I think is actually like lots of optimizations that we can deploy there. But there's a lot of workloads that are still thinking about this control flow paradigm, where one task after the other, running at 1 a.m. Every night, for example. And so that's actually a big amount of the workloads that we see on Databricks. And so this is what workflows caters to that orchestration, to determining when something should run in which sequence. And again, like they complement each other really well, because now you could say like, hey, DLT should be part of this, and I can just plug DLT in there and then run it every hour or run it once a night. And that allows you to sort of set this dial between latency on the one side and performance towards I actually want to save cost to some degree, and maybe the latency or the freshness of the data is not as important. And so that's sort of like one way to play that knob and to dial that knob in. But yeah, that's kind of the key difference, is control flow versus data flow.
Cool. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Mute, a bit noisy in the background. So when you're working with a bunch of so you got a load of jobs, got loads of different settings, lots of things scheduled. How do you match? So how do you control who can actually use them? How do you maintain them? How do you know when it's ran and all that kind of stuff? How do you go about looking after your workflows once they're actually there?
Yeah. So there is, of course, a way to observe these, and we could look at a few screens for that, where you could see, hey, what are the runs that are actually happening on this workspace? We have, I could show you some charts for this, but sort of we display all of the runs for all of the workflows over time. It's easy to see which ones are failing, which ones are running, how many are running, by whom they are running, what are the most common issues, like when something fails, are there any patterns across your workspace? And you can also like check out cost, like what were the most costly jobs that I've actually run? Who are the, which are the tags? We see a lot of customers that have different teams running on, a workspace, tagging up and for internal accounting of who actually spent that cost. And you can dive into that as well, something called system tables. And so we've got that observability at like a workspace level. Then at the next step at an individual job, where you can dial into, we call this the matrix view, where you can see like, hey, how long did each run take over time? Is there anything that's happening? Like, are they gradually taking longer and longer? You could see like if something's flaky, which task was it always that has created that, across the 500 tasks that we support now. And so then you can actually look into each individual run, which is the tasks that were skipped. So that's the 3 levels. You can look at that at a workspace level, at a job level, and at the individual run level. And each of those allow you to detect sort of these patterns and get into a debug mode of, hey, is there something wrong? Do I need to do something about it, both from a performance, a cost, but also from a stability perspective, detecting those patterns. And so when you say like, hey, when should I look at that job? One pattern that I see a lot is like, people playing whack-a-mole at the end of the month or quarter, where they'd be like, hey, what was the thing? This is the job that cost us the most money, and like, let's spend some time actually optimizing that one. And so you identify these patterns, identify the outliers that are most of your spend, and then go in there and optimize them. That's where it's worth spending some time, at least while you still have classic clusters. Hopefully we can do this in serverless really soon for you. So then that just means like, hey, are we still fine with that business goal that this one needs to actually finish super fast, or should we dial this a little bit back and, hey, maybe cost is more sort of a concern? Or this other dial where we talked about DLT, where you're like, hey, these are running streaming right now because we want super low latency. We want the data freshness. Should we dial this a bit back? And actually, it's enough if this runs once an hour, right? So those are the trade-offs that I see happening a lot, and where at the end of the month, even if everything runs smoothly, nothing's failing, where you can still check on, and we make it very easy for you to check on that. And of course, when something fails, we have integrations through webhooks with a variety of systems, and Slack, for example. But also you'll get an email, you can set up those alerts, and they bring you directly into that job, and you can see again, what has happened. You can see the code, you can see the error messages, you can dive into Ganglia and really start your debug journey for that specific job run very quickly. So yeah.
Muting and unmuting. There we go. So it is. I mean, I've got to say that. So the two key things for me, that the metrics view, like sort of the matrix of all the tasks in each of the job and which one fell, and makes debugging so easy. So I am a big fan of just
awesome.
as a data visualization nerd. It's a good visual of a DAG execution over time, which is a complex thing to try and actually articulate as a visual. And yeah, I like it. It's good. So people haven't been playing around with it for a while, and we'll get onto that as a bit of a question. If you've not looked into data workflows, you've not just had like a load of them running in production for a while and kind of looked at it, I love it. It's a truly nerdy appreciation of that's a good schedule run ETL view.
There's an Eng team here in Amsterdam that is now probably cheering exactly in this moment. So you made some folks really happy right now.
And on the other side, absolutely, the observability thing. So the scraping the system tables and being able to say, this is where our money's being spent. This is the hotspot. That the things that we used to have to build a load of stuff to like manually do it. We have like DB labs, like Overwatch, that kind of stuff on it. Scrape all that data to try and actually have something to understand. And just having a table, we can go just regularly sync that, and I'll go and query it and go, oh, that job's cost me a lot of money. I'll sort that one out first, rather than focusing over there. I mean, these are the things that just make people's lives a lot easier.
Yeah,
which is great. Okay, more questions. Making things dynamic. So the question I've got is, can we dynamically pass parameters into a workflow from ADF? Now, you mentioned that there's really a workflow in the thing where you can make it happen. So how would you go about doing it? And I guess you want to talk a bit more about how some of the new features inside workflows that are dynamic and are starting to add some of that, making it a little bit more metadata.
Yeah, absolutely. So jobs are fully parameterizable right now. So that means you can set parameters for the execution. Those parameters are accessible in the code that you will then run in the individual tasks. There's also each task can emit values that are accessible in the other tasks. We call these task values, for those that are more familiar with Airflow. It's called XComs there. So we have that same concept as well. And so now that allows you to do a ton of things at the DAG level, at the job level, but also within the code itself. So that allows you, for example, to say, hey, if a job parameter is X or Y, or if a task value that's emitted from one of the tasks processing upstream is a certain value, then I want to run a specific task or to go down a specific branch, versus in other cases might have that other branch. Or we talked about and so this is already available today. And also we talked about for each, as we call, like looping over certain values. So imagine you have a bunch of countries whose data you want to analyze, or you have a few departments or other types of data tables that you want to iterate over. Then you can insert that as task values, and then we will run a task over all of these values. And we can even spin up other jobs based on those values. So really creating sort of a meta level job above other jobs if you need to, right? You can do that abstraction as well, because we have a task now that actually triggers other jobs as well. And so that gives you that level of abstraction where you can much more dynamically create these jobs, execute them, and make the whole jobs experience more modular. You can start reusing these. And we talked about Databricks asset bundles. Of course, that's one way then to also define them much more as code, and then dynamically deploy them and make them much more dynamic in nature. So one example that I see, for example, several customers use is where somebody internally might not actually even see Databricks, but they're like, hey, I want this data about this category or about this store. or about something specific. And then they go to an internal interface and they say, hey, give me this data. And then under the hood, it actually runs Databricks. It runs that same job, but it's just modularized to whichever table it needs to pick the data up from. That's what it gets as a parameter. And then it runs basically that same job again and again, but with these different parameters for these different use cases, for these different internal users and customers. So yeah, quite excited about that one. The for each is hopefully coming very soon. So the looping over the tasks and conditionals you already have today. And there's a bunch of ways you can, of course, we have an API. When you do the run request of a job, you can then specify with which parameters do I actually want to run this. And so with the web activity, that's also available through ADF, for example, but also through Airflow or any other script or tool that you want to use.
Cool. So they got pretty much answered the next question as well, which was the can we dynamically build a workflow based on external metadata? So
Yeah.
as long as if that kind of run for each kind of thing means you can get a task that runs some kind of Spark, it goes off query to table, runs something in Hive, goes to Unity catalog, brings it back, and then you can pass that little array back up to the workflow to pass on to the next task as the thing to for each over. That's honestly the most common orchestration pattern. But that's the main reason we're going, oh, we need a really complex orchestration. And just building that in just meets so many requirements.
Oh yeah, like just the infrastructure for that. I think the thing that in these patterns where I see opportunity to improve is, depending on what you put as a parameter, your compute might also want to change. You might want to change that. And we talked about how hard it is to size that, right? So I see in these patterns often a lot of oversizing. And so hopefully serverless will solve that as well, right? Like we're actually dynamically sizing this up and down. Autoscaler is another good solution for that. If you can make sure that the instance types that you specified are the ones across that whole spectrum of possible, input values or parameters that you're using. But so yeah, that'll be very exciting for more modularization and actually taking the burden of thinking through all of the use cases that could be the parameters in there and specifying the infrastructure for that again. So because we will be able to do that for you.
And I guess today there's another question. I think we've come back to it. It's almost we've given people the tools to answer. So is there a way to run different jobs depending on a runtime value? So execute different workflows depending on how many rows of data you use. And that mix of things you're saying in terms of you can have one job that does something, returns some results, and then your conditional value allows you to then plug in several different things. So you can start to build these complex orchestration. Any of the design advice you could give on so run a different kind of workflow if different, if your data shape is different.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can do this. I think you still have, as I said, the challenge of I need to predict roughly what's going to come in, right? It can't be anything, right? It's going to be within this set of tables, it's going to be within that set of department stores or within that set of, product ranges that I want to run the data off. And you'll have to think about what could come in, right? Cluster sizing and things like that. So yeah, but you can totally do it.
And there's some you get some the deeper, mature kind of end-to-end warehouse building kind of things. You've had one thing we've seen in a lot of places where they never want to expose bad data. There's some places though where the philosophy is, yeah, well, if you put garbage in, you'll get garbage out, and it's better to show the users that, and then they'll fix their data. It's fine. Other places, it's no, we're not going to refresh our gold layer if the data's bad. And being able to do things like that, and actually to have some data quality scoring as part of your earlier layers, and then go, do we want to actually refresh the curated assets? Or no, our data quality scores. So there's some interesting patterns you can start to see.
Yeah, exactly. So you could say, hey, what's the quality of the data that was produced from the upstream task? And then condition on hey, something went wrong here. Let me actually fail this. Let me send out an alert. Let me do, is there corrective actions that I can automatically take? And there's some procedures where we can actually recover automatically, right? If it was, infrastructure failures or things like that, we would automatically retry, or other failures that are intermittent, we would automatically retry, and you can configure that. But if that's not the case, you could say, hey, I, want to proceed depending on the data quality on thresholds that you set with expectations, or do I not want to do that? And so yeah, there's a lot of awesome patterns that will make this even more automated that are coming.
Which is awesome. Okay, so we've got slightly different change tech. So how do workflows work with Unity catalog? So lineage tracking, that kind of stuff. Well, how do they speak to each other?
Yeah, fully integrated. So that means you can actually see lineage within workflows, and every workflow, when it touches any of your data, any of your tables, you can see that it was that workflow. So it's also like, to an earlier point, when we talked about debugging, hey, an analyst comes to me, he's like, some of that data is like, this is weird, right? There's a lot of nulls in there. Something's wrong. So where did this actually come from? So you can trace this easily up down the path. What we see a lot happening is that it's not just a single job that creates the data, or that modifies the data, or that goes across the bronze, silver, gold layer, but it's in many cases also multiple different teams that are working together to produce that data. And so that means they, just from an organizational and management perspective, they need to split this up in separate jobs. And so lineage really helps connect the dots of where did the data actually come from, where did the issues arise, and then the job might have actually completed successfully, right? We see that a lot happening, but then something on the upstream data was not right, or the schema has changed, and then it just produced a bunch of nulls, or some other data, it wasn't processing the date values correctly. So then you can pinpoint, where did that actually come from, where was the data changed, and lineage allows you to pinpoint on that job, go to that team, and hey, there's something now, we might need to do a backfill, we need to repair these, we might need to rerun them. So that becomes a lot easier with full lineage and UC integration, and we do full lineage. The other thing that's also quite interesting as a pattern is, when we talk about data, is triggering based on data changes, which is, we already have file arrival triggers. That means, once a file, could be a signal file, we see, for example, a lot of our customers have other partners that they work with who dump data on blob storage. And then you could be like, hey, once this data has arrived, I actually want to process and run this job. And so that means, they're not checking like every hour, has the data arrived, and they're, spinning up clusters without a reason for that. But we can actually do this for them and only run the job, and actually, only cause costs to them also when the data has actually arrived. So we will actually poll in that location for new data arriving for them, and only trigger their job and only spin up clusters for them when they actually need it. The other exciting thing there is to sort of be more data aware and trigger these jobs when tables have changed. So any Delta table, you can start observing. Obviously, you need to have access to that. And then you can say, hey, once this has updated, only then run my job. And so that makes that paradigm of multiple parts of the organization working together much easier, almost a little bit like a data mesh kind of paradigm, where one organization could be upstream, finance or, orders or so. They will get some data in, and they will have that processed. And then downstream, they might want to, predict, hey, what's going to be the orders for the rest of the quarter? Let's see when the latest actuals came in, and then I will run my inference or my training. And so then you can say, hey, only when these Delta tables are updated, I will actually trigger these downstream jobs. And I depend on these upstream teams, but the upstream teams don't necessarily need to know. Right? They don't have to inform that, making this collaboration a much more lightweight, much more data-centric way.
Cool, very cool. I've got a little best practice question, kind of getting towards the end of time, but I've still got to sneak a few more in. Streaming jobs. So if you're streaming jobs with workflows, so things that just are going to constantly be running, they're not kind of batch triggered on the schedule. What's best practices? How do you manage that? How do you maintain it? How should you think about setting it up?
Yeah. So when you do streaming, there's various ways of thinking about streaming, right? There is Spark streaming, of course, and then that means Delta Live Table is a really good way to do that. And you can run those in two kinds of fashions. One is it runs really continuously, or you actually run it in batches. Every hour, update from what the latest was. And so that's kind of like streaming. There is the mode of obviously running it continuously. And you have the dial of how often do I actually want to run this, to have sort of this latency versus cost kind of trade-off. Now, Jobs itself has a dedicated mode for streaming. So I think we're like one of the very few orchestrators that actually have very good streaming support. And so you switch on what we call continuous mode. And that means, if this thing actually goes down, we will automatically restart it for you and make sure that your stream is always up and running. And we'll provide you all the right settings for it to make sure that your data is running really well there. There's also more dedicated observability for streaming in particular coming. So for example, around the latency of the data that was actually ingested, how far are you behind, so that it helps on the health of that stream as well. And so, yeah, you have one task in there, and we'll just keep it running for you. You don't have to worry about it anymore.
And I think that's something that people who are fairly new to Spark streaming and fairly new to writing that notebook and just hitting go and then just hit perma running. I think people get scared by the fact that it fails, but it's Spark. Spark was never designed to have a cluster that is stood up for years and ends and never restarts. And the whole point of like Spark's job is it's going to fail and then it's going to restart and it's just going to keep going and just having essentially everything in there to go. You know what? It's going to fail, but that's a natural part of having an ephemeral bit of compute. It's going to go down and it's going to bounce back up and carry on from where it left. And I think there's a really good blog from Databricks about the best practices for streaming, which is essentially all the settings you've mentioned, the continuous mode, the infinite retries, all of those stuff. Just tick all these things, and you're going to have a good time. You're going to be a happy person.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah,
so
it's really good.
We'll take care of it for you. We'll just keep it running for you. Just set continuous, and then you're good to go.
And I've got two final questions. So a final quick one. Figuring things outside of Databricks. So if someone wanted to kick off a workflow or send a notification to Teams or Slack or something that's doing, or they want to trigger, maybe they want to turn things up and they want to trigger an Airflow or an ADF job and they want to trigger that.
Yeah.
How do you guys see that?
Yeah. So ultimately, I think, we're running arbitrary code. So that means like every of those tasks could be anything that you can imagine that, you have access to that has an API or, SDK you can actually access and change and run and modify and trigger and orchestrate. So we're already orchestrating all of those things in that sense, right? But that's, of course, an unsatisfactory answer, right? We want to make that easier. And so one of the things that we're investing over the coming year, and that we announced at also the last Data and AI Summit, is that we actually want to make orchestration of these external tasks much, much easier even. So it means like, hey, sending emails, doing API calls to APIs, checking what's the result, or maybe just sending it out and going for it. We want to integrate partners, for example. You've seen some of the task types for dbt, for example. And so we want to have a deeper integration with a lot of these services and make it much, much easier, more templatized for you to orchestrate these external services. Because we totally, like you said, Simon, like the need for, hey, I just want to do this little small thing, right? Why do I have to spin up a whole Spark cluster for that? Why do I have to write my own code for that? That's such a repeated task. Let me just, publish a Jira ticket. Let me just, publish that task in Salesforce. So all of these things are common patterns that we want to solve by also enabling orchestration of things outside of the direct lakehouse, particularly also partners, starting with partners first, and then also going with some standard solutions beyond that. So absolutely, yeah, you can do it today, but it's not super scalable and easy yet, and we're going to make it much, much easier.
It's a fairly traditional, like, sort of the legacy message from Databricks of course you can do it, build it yourself. Do anything you want, build it yourself. Yeah. But yeah, making it easier and more accessible, and meaning people can build it into their workflows and visualize it and have it tracked by your lineage and things is, it's going to be, there's lots of exciting things you can do with that, with everything else that's coming. Okay, so to kind of sort of start to finish things off, well, I've got two questions. Now, we've covered a lot of these things, honestly. So one, if someone hadn't looked at workflows for a year or 2 years and they knew it from the ground up, what is the one thing that they should go and check out? And then on the flip side, what's of all the things coming? We've mentioned a few features that are pretty new, a few things that are on the roadmap. What are you most excited about? What is the big things going to change the most stuff?
Yeah, I mean, like, workflows has changed so much over just even the last year. So there's like, I think more than 40 features or so that we've launched. And so there's like, integrating more with the entire lakehouse from SQL tasks. We talked about dbt tasks, more conditionals. Don't think we talked about queuing, but that's like one of the things that came up. So you can queue your tasks if you're running into limits for how many concurrent tasks you want to run, and queuing them up automatically, or if you want to do that for backfills. We talked about parameterization and modularization of tasks, trigger types. So I think there's a lot of stuff that has launched. I think Databricks workflows has significantly changed just over the last year. And so I would encourage everybody to just check it out. It's super easy. We even have these trial things where you don't even need a Databricks account, and you can go in there and click through it to get a feel from it. So just check that out, get a feel for it. And in terms of like, what am I most excited about? I mean, the answer is going to be, I think you noticed this already in the last hour or so. I'm super excited about serverless. So serverless is going to make things even easier, right? We talked about external orchestration and making that easier. Serverless is going to make things way, way easier. We see a lot of people like spending a lot of time sizing those clusters, and that changes over time also. What's the right size? What's the right specs? And serverless is sort of the frontier of making things really simple at Databricks, and at the same time, saving TCO for our customers, deploying the expertise that Databricks has at hand with how to run Spark really well and efficiently, and then giving that to all of our customers out there. And we said at the intro, hey, one of my motivations personally for why I think Databricks is super exciting, and is because we enable all of these customers, all of our customers and companies out there to actually make use of data, do that at a scale, even for small customers where they don't have like many engineers to think about the infrastructure. And so serverless is really a good answer for that, where you don't have to think about this anymore. I don't need to be a Spark expert. I don't need to know about which instance types exist on Azure or AWS or GCP. And so let the experts take care of that. Let them optimize for what my business goal, what I have in mind for this job is. And then I think that enables a whole new set of users and customers to use data and drive analytics and drive insights out of that data for their companies and for their use. So that's what I'm super excited about.
Cool. But you can still be a Spark expert.
It's okay.
Awesome. I mean, so it's very obvious there's so much coming down the pipeline. There's so much that people should be trying out and having a look at. Quite like the kind of, if you're thinking about things as fairly simple cron things, you're thinking of jobs when now you think how much extra features has gone in. So yeah, no, very cool. So we'll wrap it up there. I think there's a few more questions in the chat, but we'll kind of make sure people are responded to, and we'll wrap those up and get some more answers out. But yeah, thank you for joining. Thanks for sharing so much of what's going on.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast. Thanks, Simon. Talk soon again.
Cheers. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this second episode of Ask Databricks. So hopefully that is all of your workflow questions answered, and all of your ideas about how we stitch together things, we orchestrate tasks, how we orchestrate across different platforms. So much we've covered, and hopefully that is all the questions that you had burning ready to be answered. So the next Ask Databricks is coming in 2 weeks' time on October the 4th, and that will be all about Unity. So we're going to have Paul Room here again from Databricks product team talking about how Unity Catalog works and answering all of your burning questions. And I know that you guys have 1,000,001 questions about Unity practices and setup and adoption and migration and features and all of the million things that were announced at the Data AI Summit that is coming because of Unity. And so, yeah, get your questions in. We'll meet you there, and we'll be publishing all the links and things very, very soon. Until then, thanks for joining. Cheers.